Gamers, that's you, and I'm me, Greg Haggerty. Now, maybe you're wondering, just you? Where's Logan? Well, he hasn't gotten around to playing all these games yet, so he has to sit this one out. Besides, I've been wanting to make more individual content on the channel for a while now as a kind of supplement to our other content, so look forward to more videos with just me. I have been a big FromSoftware stan since like 2015 when Bloodborne came out, and I've since played through the entire catalog of atrociously difficult games from start to finish multiple times each. So today we're going to be ranking every game from Demon Souls to Elden Ring from worst to best. Keep in mind this list is based purely off my own enjoyment of each game and is definitely not definitive. I'd love to hear your take though, so sound off in the comments below and let me know how you'd rank FromSoftware's library. Rounding out the bottom of the list at number 7 is going to be good old Dark Souls 2. This game is like the Star Wars prequels of Dark Souls, if that makes any sense. When it first launched, most people were pretty positive about Dark Souls 2, but as time went on, more and more of the game's flaws were exposed, public opinion turned sour. And for a good while there, hating on Dark Souls 2 was the cool thing to do in the Souls community. But after the release of Elden Ring, which incorporated some of the best features from Dark Souls 2, people have, much like the prequel trilogy, started to come around on this game. Unfortunately, even though I've always been a defender of this game, it does have its issues, and something had to come in last place. Power stancing, the ability to gain a unique moveset upon dual-wielding two weapons of the same type, was a great feature and one I'm happy to see back in Elden Ring, and the PvP in this game is perhaps the best in the series. It's certainly a contender at the very least. But the PvP has never really been the reason I play these games, and all the amazing weapons and armor featured in Dark Souls 2 aren't quite enough to save it from some of the least impressive bosses in the series, and level design that feels much more constrictive and linear than the rest of the series. I also have a particular bone to pick with the enemy placement here. It really feels like the motto for this game, perhaps leaning too hard into the successful marketing of the first game, was harder equals better at any cost. And the result is areas that feels like they've just had loads of enemies dumped in arbitrarily for the sake of making it more of a pain in the ass to get through. The game's overall slower pace of combat, while not a bad thing in and of itself, definitely doesn't feel like it meshes very well with taking on massive gank squads around every corner. Dark Souls 2 also feels like it's pushing back against the player for doing the classic blitz technique of running through an area to get back to the boss as fast as possible. All the ganky enemies combined with the slower pace, and the fact that for some fucking reason this is the only game in the series that doesn't give you iframes on animations like opening doors and chests or walking through fog walls, means enemies can interrupt these actions if you don't clear them all out on the way there. There seems to be some kind of a solution to this in the fact that if you kill enemies enough times, they'll eventually just stop respawning entirely. I think this was to prevent players from grinding too much, but you can just use it to clear out a particularly annoying area if you don't mind wasting a ton of time killing all the enemies over and over again. Also, having to waste souls leveling ADP so that your dodge works properly is lame. Sorry, not sorry. All in all, Dark Souls 2 is still a Dark Souls game, so there's a lot of fun to be had, and I have found myself with the urge to revisit it from time to time. But its flaws weigh it down just enough for me to have to push it to the bottom of the list. Number 6, Demon Souls. The oft-forgotten granddaddy of the Souls games, if you don't count Kingsfield, is one that a lot of people haven't had the chance to play. Being a pretty niche title at the time of its original release and relegated to PS3 exclusivity when the series finally popped off years later, made it so most Souls fans couldn't get their hands on it. That is, until 2020 when Bluepoint gave it a shiny new coat of paint on the PS5, which is really easy to get and accessible to everyone, right? Thanks, Sony. Anyway, I was one of the lucky few fortunate enough to get my hands on a PS5, so I was able to try out the Demon Souls remake, which is what I'm ranking today. I haven't played the original, so I can't say for sure if it's better or worse than this version, but I've heard that besides the graphics and a few small quality of life improvements, the remake is basically the same as the original, so this ranking applies to both versions. I have to give credit where it's due. Demon Souls basically single-handedly invented an entire subgenre of RPG and laid the foundations for one of the most beloved series in all of gaming. And it got a remarkable amount of it right on the first try. The Kingdom of Boletaria is absolutely dripping with atmosphere, and the Archstone system allows players to explore a variety of diverse locales with interesting level design in any order they want without sacrificing the cohesion of the world. The downside of this system is that the worlds you visit often feel more video gamey than the rest of the series, like distinct levels with a direct path and a boss at the end that you just have to clear in one go rather than an interconnected web of paths featured in the other games in the series. Hell, in the original release, the levels didn't even have names, they were just called things like 1-1 or 3-2 like a Mario level. Demon Souls also has some of the easiest bosses in the franchise. Some of them, like Flame Lurker and False King Allant, do pose a challenge, but most of them are gimmick fights that are more about figuring out what you're supposed to do than they are about actually using your combat skills. The bosses aren't necessarily bad, but they are quite simple and lack the threat factor I expect out of a FromSoft boss fight. Although this can be forgiven a bit, as it was their first attempt at a game like this. The lore of the world is very interesting, but in comparison to later games, it does feel a bit sparse. If you go in expecting to find juicy tidbits of history and world building on every item description, then expect to be disappointed. Most item descriptions are pretty bare bones, and the majority of lore is actually found in NPC dialogue. That's not inherently a bad thing, but it does leave the world and items feeling somewhat lacking if you're coming to this game from later entries. The last thing that places this game where it is the world tendency system. While a cool idea in theory, having the state of the world react to your actions, how it all works is never really explained properly in game, and because of this, it's very easy to miss out on a ton of the game's story simply because you made a mistake that you weren't even aware was a mistake, like neglecting to kill yourself at the Nexus after beating a boss so that you never die in human form in one of the levels, which would drive you towards a black world tendency. I know obscure systems are a hallmark of games like these, but I think in this one it would have benefited from a bit more explanation. Number 5. Dark Souls 1. This may be a bit of a controversial pick considering the original Dark Souls is a lot of people's favorite, but I think number 5 is a reasonable place for this one. Dark Souls really refined and polished a lot of the ideas present in Demon Souls, while implementing a lot of new features as well, but a rushed second half held the game back from achieving the same heights later games would go on to achieve. The sprawling, interconnected world filled to the brim with secrets to uncover has got to be my favorite aspect of the first Dark Souls. That moment when you take the elevator in the undead parish and realize you're back in Firelink Shrine, or when you realize that you can curl up in a ball in the Raven's Nest to be taken all the way back to the asylum at the beginning of the game, those are just a tiny portion of all the mind-blowing discoveries lying in wait in the world of Lordran. And the lack of fast travel in the first half, something that frustrated me on my initial playthrough, is actually a key feature in driving home just how expertly woven together the level design is. The lore present in Dark Souls is also a major step up from Demon Souls, and strikes the perfect balance of obscure and obtainable, and features some of the most compelling characters in the series, like my boy Artorias the Abyss Watcher, and his loyal companion Sif, Dragon Slayer Ornstein, Solaire Vestora, Gwyn the Lord of Cinder, just to name a few, most of whom you get to fight in spectacular fashion, then cry over when you watch Vaati explain their backstories. Unfortunately, for all the tremendous highs that Dark Souls 1 brings to the table, it also has a very steep drop-off in quality after you obtain the Lord Vessel in Anor Londo. There are still things to appreciate in this section of the game, and the DLC areas are fantastic, but there are also some real stinkers that drag down the experience for me. Pretty much all of Lost Izalith and the Tomb of the Giants are a nightmare to get through, and were clearly unfinished. The bosses in this half also feel a lot less inspired, with the Bed of Chaos being the obvious offender. But Gravelord Nito with his gank skeletons and mandatory fall damage, Seath the Scaleless with his AoE spam and crystal gimmick, and the Four Kings being entirely trivialized by a certain armor set. The Lord Soul bosses, while not entirely terrible, do feel like a step down from the first half of the game. The addition of fast travel with the Lord Vessel also feels like an excuse for the devs to slack off a little bit with the interconnectedness of the levels, since the second half lets you just teleport around. There doesn't need to be as many secret paths and shortcuts. All in all, Dark Souls 1 is a great game that falls just shy of its potential. Number 4. Dark Souls 3. Dark Souls 3 has some of the best bosses in the entire series, as well as some of my favorite areas and DLC. The combat is also a nearly perfected version of what was introduced in Demon Souls and iterated upon in every preceding game, with Bloodborne perhaps contributing most to the overall faster pace of the game and focus on dodging rather than blocking most attacks. Fights like the Abyss Watchers, Pontiff Sullivan, however you say his name, the Soul of Cinder, Slave Knight Gale, the Nameless King, the Twin Princes, and so many more feel like a logical conclusion of what this series was building to at the time and present a pitch-perfect balance of hair-ripping difficulty and fair openings for smart countering. However, this game seems to have the exact opposite problem that Dark Souls 1 had. The first half of this game, at least on replay, is kind of a boring slog to trudge through, and the washed-out visual style of the game, while beautiful at times, doesn't really help with the trudgery. You've got a gray linear tutorial zone, a decent but very brown castle area, a gray and confusing to navigate undead settlement, 2 consecutive swamp areas, one of which is poison of course, a church with swamp zones both inside and out, and a brown underground maze before you get to the really fun stuff. And most of those areas are capped off with really mediocre bosses. These aren't things that bothered me much on my first run through, but after a few runs it becomes pretty tedious to get through the first chunk of this game. Thankfully, everything after the catacombs is pretty top tier and saves the game from being any lower on this list. I do love Dark Souls 3, I'd have to have played it so many times, but the rest of this list does it all just a bit better. Number 3, Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice. This is the part of the list that gets really tough for me to rank because I genuinely love all of these games near equally from here on out, and depending on my mood, the order could be rearranged in basically any way. So I'm gonna have to get real nitpicky to come up with an order for these. Sekiro is a very different game from the rest on this list. The movement and combat are much more fast-paced and rhythmic than even Bloodborne. The story is presented in a much more traditional manner, and it's not even really an RPG, it's a pure action game. Because of these differences, I debated excluding it from the list entirely, but at the end of the day, it felt wrong to leave it out. Despite its differences, I believe Sekiro is a more than worthy part of the Souls pantheon. That being said, I hated this game at first. I remember being super hyped when the game was announced, as I was already balls deep in the FromSoft fandom at that point. But when I picked up the game on launch day, the combat just did not click for me. As a Souls veteran, I guess I expected to be able to dive in with little to no learning curve. But boy, I got my ass handed to me over and over and over again with no idea why I was so bad at it. I got frustrated, blamed my failures on the game, and after making it to Ashina Castle, I decided it just wasn't for me and dropped the game. About 3 years later, after hearing non-stop praise about how great the game was, I decided to put my ego aside and try again, taking the game on its own terms and really trying to learn. It was a struggle, but when it finally clicked, holy cow, this has got to be my favorite combat system FromSoft has ever made. Timing your blocks to the beat of your foe's attacks, clashing blades and building up a barrage of tiny parries to open up a massive opening to decimate their entire health bar in one blow is just so damn satisfying every single time. The lack of a stamina bar and focus on stealth, speed, and aggression combine into a furiously fun combat system that really makes you feel like Batman. I mean a ninja. The story is also incredibly accessible for a FromSoft game, with a main character who actually talks and cutscenes that actually explain what's going on. Don't get me wrong, I love the treasure hunt style of storytelling these games usually employ, but it's very refreshing to experience a more traditional storyline for once, one where characters and stakes are pushed to the forefront rather than hidden away from the player. The bosses are also remarkably challenging and memorable. I'll never forget the moment when that stupid ape who took me an hour to kill just stood back up after the screen saying I'd won the fight and proceeded to kick my ass way harder than ever before. Peak FromSoft stuff right there. Beating him and every other boss, except maybe the folding screen monkeys, was a genuine thrill every single time. The only thing holding this game back is really just how much I love the games coming up on this list, and maybe the lack of RPG stuff, which I don't really fault the game for since that's not what it was trying to do. I just like making number go bigger when fight good. Number 2, Elden Ring. The newest game on this list, and the only one to go truly open world, Elden Ring did have me feeling skeptical at first. Open world is a big trend in the games industry right now, with just about every major studio giving it a shot, especially after the insane success of Breath of the Wild. But it doesn't always pan out for the imitators, leading to a product that feels watered down and stretched thin. This is not the case for Elden Ring. Taking everything that worked for previous games and blasting it wide open into a truly massive and unbelievably detailed world that feels more alive and polished than some linear games, Elden Ring's sheer scale and consistent quality blew me away. Every time I was absolutely sure that I'd seen everything this game had to offer, the map would unfurl even further beyond to strange new lands even bigger and crazier than what I'd already explored. Incorporating more linear and interconnected levels just like the old games seamlessly woven into a larger world. Not to mention an entire extra map beneath the map encompassing a gigantic underground cave system with its own dungeons and bosses to explore. Bosses to explore, dungeons to explore, and bosses. Elden Ring certainly has its fair share of issues. The balancing of endgame content all but requiring the use of spirit summons for most players, or the reuse of bosses, or the fact that most of your loot will be useless to your build since there are so many and not every item works for every player. But in all honesty, these issues pale in comparison to the Herculean accomplishment that this game represents. The sense of discovery and true exploration is only really rivaled by Breath of the Wild itself, and I think Elden Ring even surpasses it in some respects. The gameplay itself, much like Dark Souls 3 before it, feels like the culmination of all the previous games. Power stancing from Dark Souls 2, stealth and jumping attacks from Sekiro, using a shield being a viable playstyle again, like in Demon's Souls thanks to the new guard counter, the labyrinthian level design of Dark Souls 1, and the speed and aggression incentivized in Bloodborne. With bosses that make use of all these mechanics. I would turn down the damage a bit in the endgame though. As someone who played all the previous games solo, I'm ashamed to say I did lean on my Mimic tier quite a bit in the first playthrough, which made some of the bosses way too easy, but it was way too hard without it. Anyway, that issue aside, all of it comes together beautifully and makes Elden Ring an easy choice for second place. Number 1, Bloodborne. Alright, I'll admit that I'm more than a little biased here. Bloodborne was my first Souls-like experience, and this is the game that got me into the series, so I definitely have a soft spot for it. But even so, I think my ranking would still be valid even if I hadn't started here. To think I almost quit this one too. As a Souls newbie at the time, Father Gascoigne was simply too much for me, and I think if I hadn't summoned help for him, I wouldn't have gotten into the series. So shout out to whoever that random player was who helped me out way back at the beginning. We'll start with the setting. The gothic Bram Stoker-esque Victorian aesthetic is easily the most atmospheric and haunting in the series, and the way it unfurls into an eldritch nightmare straight out of an H.P. Lovecraft novel as the game progresses is a brilliant subversion of your expectations. The creature design and bosses are all beautifully creepy and intimidating in a way that traditional fantasy monsters like dragons and trolls just don't compare to. From deformed werewolves made of stitched together body parts to tentacular alien abominations to blood-swollen vampiric insect people, Bloodborne's bestiary is on another level. And the combat, God, I love dodging an R1 spam, and Bloodborne is the game for dodging an R1 spam. I don't know why, but that shit just scratches a particular itch on my little goblin-ass gamer brain that I can't get enough of. Switching from a roll to a sidestep while locked on, and banishing shields to the Shadow Realm along with a rally mechanic that allows you to regain health if you strike back fast enough, makes fights into a fast and furious blaze of heart-pounding joy. The level design too is amazing. The way the levels twist around and loop back in on themselves just like Dark Souls 1 is actually maintained for the whole game, and while the areas don't quite connect as much as in that game, when it does happen, it's just as impactful. Secrets too are aplenty. Discovering Canehurst Castle or the Upper Cathedral Ward for the first time are some of my favorite moments in gaming. And speaking of favorites, hot damn is the DLC fantastic. All these games have great DLC, but the Old Hunters stands well above the rest in my opinion. I mean, the Hunter's Nightmare, Ludwig the Accursed and his Moonlight Greatsword, My Wife, Lady Maria, the Fishing Hamlet, the Orphan of Kos. Holy shit, I could sit here and name stuff from this game with an amazed tone all day. But all of those bosses and areas are certified slappers for sure. Maybe it is just the nostalgia for my first time talking here, but I truly can't think of anything I don't like about this game. From the very first banger of an area with Central Yharnam, all the way through to the final epic battle with the Moon Presence, I simply adore Bloodborne. So that's the list. Do you agree with me, or is your ranking completely different? Honestly, all of these games are good enough that I could see any of them topping someone else's list. So let me know down below. I'm small enough right now that I can interact with pretty much all of my comments, so I would love to chat with you about it. And don't forget to drop a like if you enjoyed the video, and be sure to subscribe if you want more content like this. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.